Okay, let's unpack this. We are embarking on a really close look at Psalm 59.
Right.
And this is a source that's, what, over 3,000 years old?
hmm
But it feels like it holds a blueprint for turning, crisis into confidence.
It really does. And for this, we're guided by a pretty exhaustive and insightful study from the You Need Faith in Jesus team.
So our mission today is very specific.
Very specific. We want to dissect this prayer verse by verse and show you how David navigated one of the most dangerous nights of his entire life.
The night when he was trapped, completely surrounded.
Exactly. And how he used that very real fear to fuel, well, a truly profound act of faith. This isn't just some theoretical exercise.
No.
It's a lesson in finding strength in God's absolute sovereignty when your entire world is falling apart.
And that distinction is just so crucial. The fact that this is rooted in real-world terror. As the commentary from the You Need Faith in Jesus team really emphasizes, Psalm 59 is not abstract poetry. To get the depth of David's faith, we have to start with that historical anchor.
You have to.
We need to feel like we're standing there with him, behind that locked door.
Absolutely. And the title of the psalm itself is, it's almost more telling than the verses that follow because it just sets the scene so perfectly.
How does it say?
It reads, "To the chief musician, Altashith, Michtam of David, when Saul sent and they watched the house to kill him."
Wow.
That last phrase, when Saul sent and they watched the house to kill him, it just transports us directly to the account in the book of 1 Samuel.
Right, chapter 19.
Specifically verse 11.
And that is the pivotal night, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is when King Saul, who's just been driven mad by jealousy and, frankly, fear of David's rising popularity, finally decides murder is the only option.
And it wasn't a sudden fit of rage either.
No, this was calculated. This was an orchestrated execution attempt.
Precisely. And the text from 1 Samuel chapter 19, verse 11 is just chilling. It says, "Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, If thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain."
Just try to put yourself in that scenario.
It's impossible to imagine.
You're the greatest hero in the kingdom, celebrated by everyone, and yet you are hiding in your own bedroom, while professional killers, the king's men, are stationed right outside your door,
Just waiting.
waiting for the sun to rise to end your life. Psalm 59 is the raw, honest prayer that David composed during those hours of darkness and dread.
The psychological pressure of that countdown.
Yeah.
It must have been just unbearable.
And it's fascinating, isn't it, that David, facing what looks like certain death, wasn't just panicking.
No.
He was composing. And the sources you mentioned point out the significance of those musical titles in the Psalm's introduction. Altashith and Michtam, they tell us something important about the nature of the prayer itself, don't they?
They do, and this is where that ancient context just really deepens our understanding. Altashith, for example, it translates to "do not destroy" or "destroy not."
Okay, so the theme is set right from the start.
Immediately. It establishes the central plea of the entire psalm, which is a prayer for preservation, for survival against these completely overwhelming odds. It's David just clinging to the hope that God will preserve his life, preserve his future, despite the very visible threat of destruction right outside.
And what about Michtam? That sounds a bit more ceremonial.
It does. Michtam is a little less certain in its meaning, but it often describes a golden or a precious poem. It implies that this composition was considered highly valuable, something worthy of permanent record.
Which is just remarkable when you think about the circumstances.
It's an incredible juxtaposition. Even while he's literally fearing for his survival, minute by minute, David was creating something enduring and precious. This crisis, this moment of pure terror, was the crucible in which a golden piece of scripture was forged.
That is such a fundamental insight, and it's one that the You Need Faith in Jesus team commentary really underscores. The most profound, the most honest, the deepest worship. It often arises not from our comfort,
Not at all.
but from the darkest, most dangerous moments. Crisis just strips away all the superficiality of religious language.
It forces total honesty. You see, God doesn't require David to offer up some vague platitudes.
Right.
He invites David to bring the specific, frightening details of his siege directly to the throne room. David didn't just pray, "Lord, help me."
Now,
He prayed, "Lord, there are men outside my door sent by the king, and they are waiting to kill me at dawn." The act of naming the threat, of describing the fear and its frightening detail, That's the necessary first step.
So the application for us, all these centuries later, is immediately apparent.
It is.
When you are facing that kind of overwhelming pressure, whether it's a huge career threat, a terrifying health diagnosis, or some crushing legal battle, your first response shouldn't be to avoid it or deny it.
No, you have to face it.
It should be total honesty in prayer, bringing the specific, frightening details of your situation to God. That principle of confronting the crisis head-on in prayer is just foundational to the teaching we find compiled by the You Need Faith in Jesus team.
You have to.
We have to acknowledge the army outside the door before we can ask the commander to act.
And recognizing the reality of that threat is what elevates the prayer from, say, a wish to an urgent petition. And that urgency is exactly what defines the opening verses.
Which moves us right into section 1, the urgent plea and defining the adversary, which covers the first 4 verses of Psalm 59. David doesn't ease into the conversation.
No, not at all.
He jumps instantly into the crisis in verse 1.
Absolutely. The language is sharp, it's immediate, it's so direct. He cries out, and I'm quoting from Psalm 59, verse 1 in the King James Version, "Deliver me from mine enemies, O my God. Defend me from them that rise up against me."
There's no wasted breath on pleasantries.
None. It's a desperate man needing instant help.
And you mentioned this is a kind of double-edged plea, deliverance and defense. Let's unpack the distinction there, because they seem to imply 2 different kinds of help.
They do. Deliver me is the immediate physical request. It's get me out of this house, past these soldiers. It's deliverance from the visible, immediate danger. But defend me, however, that's a plea for positioning. The Hebrew word implies being set on high, like placing someone securely in a citadel or a high tower, permanently out of the reach of the enemy.
So he isn't just asking for a temporary escape.
No, he's asking to be situated in a place of permanent safety that only God can provide.
It's the difference between escaping the current trap and never having to fear that trap again.
Exactly. He recognizes that his only reliable defense, the only fortress that is impenetrable by King Saul's men, is God himself.
And this seems to parallel the need for refuge we see all across the songs.
It does. The team at You Need Faith in Jesus points to Psalm 143, verse 9, which says, "Deliver me, O Lord, from mine enemies. I flee unto thee to hide me."
So this shows that the prayer for refuge isn't unique to David.
No, it's the constant first response of the faithful when they're facing persecution. For the modern listener, when you're facing spiritual or professional opposition, that immediate, honest cry to God for both deliverance from the visible threat and defense from the ultimate power structure, that remains the first and best response.
So once he's made that urgent physical request, David immediately defines the moral quality of his opposition. This is in verse 2.
Yes.
He doesn't just call them enemies or rivals. He names the sin that's behind their actions.
He clarifies the nature of the conflict, and in doing so, he escalates it beyond a simple military confrontation to a moral battleground. He prays, "Deliver me from the workers of iniquity and save me from bloody men." That's Psalm 59, verse 2.
Workers of iniquity. That's such a strong phrase.
It is. These are not just people making a mistake. They are workers of iniquity, which means they are committed to evil as a deliberate practice. It's almost like a profession for them.
And bloody men.
That indicates not just violence, but murderous hearts and a deep, unrighteous hatred.
That's a crucial distinction. This is a deadly, malice-fueled opposition he's facing. It really brings to mind the spiritual nature of conflict that the New Testament defines later on.
It really does. And what's so fascinating here is that David sees the human instruments, he sees the soldiers, but he recognizes the malevolent spiritual force that's driving them. And this is precisely the kind of discernment the Apostle Paul later urges us toward in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places."
So David understood he wasn't just fighting Saul's ambition.
No, he was fighting spiritual wickedness that was using human vessels.
And if we can make that same discernment today, seeing the spiritual wickedness behind unjust situations, it kind of removes the personal sting of it all.
It does.
It allows us to fight the conflict at a higher level, focusing our prayer against the spirit of the age, rather than just the human instrument in front of us.
That perspective is absolutely essential, and it leads directly into verses 3 and 4, where David asserts his innocence, which is just such a powerful element of his plea.
So he's not claiming to be morally perfect in general, but he is claiming that this specific attack is unjust.
Right.
That it's unprovoked by any fault of his own toward Saul.
Precisely. Verses 3 and 4 lay out his justification, he says, "For lo, they lie in wait for my soul. The mighty are gathered against me, not for my transgression, nor for my sin, O Lord. They run and prepare themselves without my fault. Awake to help me, and behold." That's from Psalm 59, verses 3 and 4 in the King James Version.
He's really standing on firm ground here. He served Saul faithfully. He protected the kingdom. He never tried to usurp the throne.
Not once.
He's facing execution without my fault.
So he's not seeking a pardon, he's seeking vindication. He's appealing to God, the righteous judge, based on the pure injustice of the situation.
And this must give his prayer a tremendous spiritual weight.
It provides immense confidence. When we suffer for doing what is right, we have a unique and powerful claim on God's justice. We're not asking him to overlook our failings.
Right.
We're asking him to intervene against the failings of others who are unjustly targeting us. This really echoes the sentiment in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 17, which says, "For it is better, if the will of God be so, that ye suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing." Suffering justly results in shame. Suffering unjustly with faith results in vindication and glory.
But if David is so confident in his innocence, why does he have to plead with God to awake? I mean, if God is the ever-present, all-seeing judge, shouldn't he already be active? Why this desperate cry, "Awake to help me," and behold?
That is a challenging question, and I think it speaks to the emotional human reality of the crisis.
Okay.
When the threat is so immediate and the danger is so palpable, armed men waiting for dawn, God can often seem absent or silent to the one who's suffering.
So he's using human language.
Yes, it's anthropomorphic language. He knows God doesn't literally sleep, but he's pleading for God to manifest his presence and power. Behold is asking God to scrutinize the situation, to see the absolute hidden truth of it. Awake is asking for that visible demonstration of divine intervention that will decisively end the siege.
So the practical application for you, the listener, as stressed by the commentary from the You Need Faith in Jesus team, is really about empowerment through truth.
Yes.
When you know you're suffering unjustly, when the opposition you face is without your fault, you possess this unique confidence to appeal to God, the righteous judge. You can demand that he see the absolute truth and act on your behalf.
And that certainty becomes powerful fuel for prayer.
It moves us from passive endurance to active appeal. And that appeal immediately escalates in verse 5. As David recognizes he needs more than just a personal bodyguard.
He needs the sovereign power of the cosmos.
Which moves us right into section 2, the appeal to sovereign justice, all in verse 5. David dramatically increases the stakes of his prayer by invoking God's most powerful, majestic titles.
He does. He shifts from the personal, "Oh my God," to the cosmic. He says, "Thou therefore, O Lord God of hosts, the God of Israel, awake to visit all the heathen. Be not merciful to any wicked transgressors." Selah. That's Psalm 59, verse 5, King James Version.
Let's spend some time on those titles. What does invoking the Lord God of hosts specifically mean in this context, where the immediate threat is just an earthly king's army?
Well, the title, Lord God of Hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth, is so crucial here. The hosts refer to the heavenly armies.
The angelic legions.
The angelic legions, the stars, all the created powers of the universe that are under God's command. By invoking this title, David is essentially saying, you are the commander-in-chief of all reality. The paltry number of soldiers outside my door are nothing compared to the armies you command.
So it's an immediate strategic move.
It's a way to dwarf the threat by magnifying the defender.
And then he pairs that with the God of Israel.
And that's the covenant anchor. The God of Israel reminds God of his unbreakable promise, the covenant he made with his people to protect them, to preserve them, to vindicate them. David is grounding his urgent personal plea in God's eternal public character.
Then he asks God to awake to visit all the heathen, and he's viewing Saul's men as if they were a godless nation. Why would David categorize his own countrymen, the soldiers of the king of Israel, as heathen and wicked transgressors?
Because of the injustice of it and the murderous intent. Their actions plotting murder, violating the core moral law of Israel, it put them functionally outside the covenant relationship. It aligned them with the predatory behavior of the surrounding pagan nations.
So that word visitation is key.
It's critical. In the Old Testament, God often visits his people and their enemies for judgment. David is asking for a formal judicial inspection and sentence.
And this brings us to the boldest, most challenging part of this verse. The request to be not merciful to them. For the modern believer, who's constantly told, to pray for their enemies, how do we reconcile this? David's prayer for justice over mercy.
That's the essential conflict we have to address. And it's important to see that David is not praying out of mere spite or personal vindictiveness.
Okay.
He is praying for systemic divine righteousness. He understands that if God shows mercy to these wicked transgressors, if their treachery is just overlooked, then God's own moral law, his justice, and his covenant with Israel are all undermined.
So his ultimate concern is the upholding of God's rule.
Yes. This is reflected in the dual nature of God described in Exodus chapter 34, verse 7, where God is merciful, but also one that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children. God's justice is a core, non-negotiable part of his nature.
And David is asking for that nature to be displayed publicly.
Precisely. It's less about his personal feeling of revenge and more about demonstrating that sin has inevitable consequences. It's a prayer for God's reputation on earth.
And if God acts,
it confirms his sovereignty. If he doesn't, it risks the enemy thinking that very thought we'll discuss later, Huda here.
and all this intense thought and theological gravity is capped by that one single word, Selah.
Ah, Selah. It's a wonderful moment of intentional reflection. It's an instruction, most likely to the musicians or the singers, to just pause.
Take a breath.
Take a breath. Maybe increase the volume or change the instrumentation. But most importantly, it instructs the listener to stop. We are meant to take a moment and absorb the immense weight of the verses that were just spoken.
Because you just heard David ask the commander of the universe, the God of the covenant, to deny mercy and execute judgment.
That requires a theological pause.
So our practical step here, and this is encouraged by the kind of discernment taught by the You Need Faith in Jesus team, it has to involve checking our motives. We can pray confidently for God's justice to be done on earth, but we have to ensure we're praying for God's perfect, righteous will to be upheld, for his glory, rather than just asking for our emotional desire for immediate retribution to be fulfilled.
A prayer for God's eternal reputation, not our momentary satisfaction. And after that tremendous elevation of thought, David brings us right back to the immediate terrifying reality of the siege in section 3. The snarling dogs and God's derision.
Right, verses 6 through 8.
Verses 6 through 8.
And David uses this incredibly vivid, visceral imagery here. He compares the king's soldiers to scavenging street dogs.
And this image is just devastating in the ancient Near East. Dogs were not pets.
No.
They were scavengers, often diseased, degraded, menacing. To compare Saul's elite troops to them just strips them of all military honor. Verses 6 and 7 paint this menacing picture. They return at evening, they make a noise like a dog and go round about the city. Behold, they belch out with their mouth. Swords are in their lips. For who, say they, doth hear? That's Psalm 59, verses 6 and 7.
The time and emotion just add to the terror. They return at evening and go round about the city. It emphasizes the darkness, the fear, and the sheer psychological warfare of the situation.
They're circling the house like predators.
It's waiting for the kill. It creates this sense of continuous threat and siege. But, it's interesting. Their greatest weapons are not their physical swords.
No, David highlights the sin of their mouths. They belch out with their mouth, which implies vulgarity, hateful rhetoric, aggressive, arrogant speech.
And their lips are like swords.
Intended to wound, to kill reputation, to spread lethal lies.
That is such a powerful metaphor for the destructiveness of hostile words. They're being judged for the intention behind their speech just as much as for their physical actions.
And this verbal violence is rooted in their deepest sin, their arrogance, which David captures so perfectly at the end of verse 7. For who, say they, doth hear?
And that's the core of their rebellion, isn't it?
It is.
It's the deep-seated atheism David perceived. They act without consequence because they believe God is absent or silent or just doesn't care.
Their hubris is breathtaking. They presume to plot murder against God's anointed because they believe the divine judge has turned his face away. This is the same arrogance that's condemned throughout Scripture, as we see in Psalm 10, verse 11. He hath said in his heart, God hath forgotten, he hideth his face, he will never see it.
They are entirely deceived by the apparent slowness of God's immediate action.
It's a potent warning for us today when we see people acting with utter confidence in their own wickedness, assuming they'll never be brought to account. We have to remember that their confidence is built on a fundamental, fatal lie, that God is deaf.
But then David, still huddled inside his house, shifts the entire axis of the conflict.
He does.
He turns his gaze from the snarling dogs outside to the throne above, and he achieves what is maybe the greatest perspective shift in the entire psalm in verse 8.
This is where it gets truly transformative. David dramatically shifts focus. But thou, O Lord, shalt laugh at them. Thou shalt have all the heathen in derision. That's Psalm 59, verse 8, from the King James Version.
God's laughter.
It is the perfect counterpoint to the enemy's arrogance. They ask, who hears? And the answer is that the Almighty not only hears, but he responds with contempt.
And this is not gentle amusement.
No, this is profound derision, mockery.
Hmm.
It is the sound of the infinite creator looking down at the spectacle of tiny, mortal beings, these puny men, plotting to derail his eternal plan, and finding the whole attempt just ridiculous.
Just strips the enemy of all their menace. The moment David sees his enemies through the lens of God's perspective, they become so much less frightening.
It's a direct reflection of God's sovereignty, which is asserted in Psalm 2, verse 4, where earthly kings are plotting vain things. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, the Lord shall have them in derision.
So the immense comfort for David and for us
Is found in that shift. When we feel intimidated by the size of the threat, we have to force ourselves to remember that in the grand scheme of God's sovereignty, our enemies' plans are already doomed to failure. They're a joke.
So what does this all mean for us practically? When we're facing that intimidating opposition, the snarling dogs of our modern crises, the crucial spiritual and psychological action is to consciously shift our focus.
Yeah.
You have to move from the magnitude of the visible threat to the absolute, unshakable sovereignty of God, the laughing God on the throne.
And anchor ourselves in the certainty that our enemy's confidence is ultimately baseless. That perspective transformation moves David from panic to patience, which is the definition of faith in action.
And we see that in section 4, the strategy of expectant waiting.
Verses 9 and 10.
David moves immediately from God's sovereignty to his own personal strategy in verse 9. He acknowledges the enemy's strength, but he chooses how he will react to it. He's translating anxiety into active trust.
He states, and this is Psalm 59, verse 9, because of his strength will I wait upon thee, for God is my defense. David is acutely aware of the enemy's strength.
Oh yeah, Saul has the state apparatus, the guards, the authority.
Everything. But it is because of that threat that he resolves to wait upon God.
And that word wait often gets misunderstood, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It can sound like passive resignation, like just sitting around hoping things get better.
Right.
But here, waiting is a strategic, determined act of active faith.
It's absolutely active. Wait upon thee, in this context, implies hopeful expectation and firm reliance. It is not lying down in defeat. It is strategically positioning oneself inside a secure fortress.
So when David declares, God is my defense,
The term literally means my high tower or my secure fortress. He's not going to try to battle the entire royal army on the open field.
no,
He will wait securely and patiently inside the provision of the divine defender.
that is profound. It's saying that true strength isn't found in frantic, self-directed activity, but in waiting securely for the divine defender to act from a position of ultimate safety.
Yes.
We have to consciously transfer our focus from the seemingly insurmountable strength of our problem to the unshakable strength of our God.
And this choice to wait patiently is the essence of faith. It's famously captured in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint.
He's choosing to activate that strength by remaining still in trust.
And this active expectant trust is a key component of what the You Need Faith in Jesus team teaches about genuine faith.
And this trust is immediately followed in verse 10 by this beautiful expression of certainty rooted in God's character, his undeserved kindness.
He immediately calls God the God of my mercy, which is such a tender term after invoking the Lord God of hosts. He says, and this is verse 10, the God of my mercy shall prevent me. God shall let me see my desire upon mine enemies.
By calling him the God of my mercy, David is acknowledging that any deliverance he gets is based purely on Hesed God's covenantal, undeserved kindness, not on his own righteousness or merit, even though he just claimed to be innocent of this specific charge.
He knows all deliverance flows from mercy, and then we have to tackle that word that so often confuses modern readers. Prevent.
Right. In modern English, prevent means to stop something from happening.
But that's not what it means here.
What does it mean in this King James context?
The crucial older meaning of prevent in King James English is to go before or to meet.
That changes the entire understanding of the verse.
Completely. David is declaring that God's mercy won't just react to his crisis. God's mercy will precede him. God will go before David, clearing the path, preparing the way, and meeting David at his point of desperate need, anticipating the crisis before David even knows how to fully articulate it.
So he's not just waiting for God to catch up to the problem.
He's trusting that God's mercy is already traveling ahead of him, making the path safe. And that is the source of his profound certainty.
This certainty allows him to declare the inevitable outcome. God shall let me see my desire upon mine enemies. This confidence is the spiritual assurance that Paul later articulates in Romans chapter 8, verse 31. What shall we then say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us?
So the practical step for the listener here is to confidently transfer that focus. True spiritual strength is found in waiting securely inside the divine defender's provision, trusting that the God of mercy goes before us in all trials.
Yes.
We can face the future not with paralyzing fear, but with the expectation of seeing God's ultimate victory.
And this confidence, anchored in God's character, leads David to one of the most surprising and theologically strategic parts of the psalm.
Section 5, the greater purpose of justice.
Right, covering verses 11 through 13. And verse 11 contains this counterintuitive prayer. After pleading for God to destroy them and denying them mercy, David suddenly prays against quick destruction. He says, "Slay them not, lest my people forget. Scatter them by thy power, and bring them down, O Lord our shield." That's Psalm 59, verse 11. Why would he fear a swift, merciful end for his enemies?
This is truly astonishing, and it elevates David from a desperate victim to a statesman who is thinking about the spiritual education of his entire nation.
Okay.
A quick death would offer immediate private relief to David, but if Saul and his men were instantly struck down, the people of Israel might quickly forget why they were struck down.
Or mistake it for an accident or a coincidence.
Exactly. So David prays for a prolonged public humiliation, a fate that serves as a permanent, visible lesson.
He wants them to be living, breathing monuments to the consequences of treason against God's anointed.
The goal is not quick vengeance. It's a prolonged, public display of God's justice. He asks God to scatter them and bring them down into a state of visible degradation and failure, so that their very existence, marred by visible failure, serves as a permanent reminder to the whole nation of Israel. Do not fight against the truth of God.
And this principle is seen elsewhere in Scripture, like with Cain in Genesis.
Yes, in Genesis chapter 4, verse 12, where Cain became a wanderer on the earth, a living monument to the consequence of murder. David is asking for the same thing. Turn his powerful, threatening enemies into perpetual, noticeable failures.
It moves the prayer beyond his personal feeling.
To God's global purposes. The highest goal in a trial is often not the swift removal of the problem, but for God to use that very struggle to teach a powerful, unforgettable, and public lesson to those watching.
And that theological depth is a critical takeaway from the study provided by the You Need Faith in Jesus team.
It is.
And what exactly is the sin that David insists must be punished so visibly? In verse 12, he brings it back to the core issue.
The sin of the mouth. He's incredibly forensic in his analysis, Psalm 59, verse 12. For the sin of their mouth and the words of their lips, let them even be taken in their pride, and for cursing and lying which they speak.
He understood that their murderous intent was born out of their pride.
And fueled by their cursing and their deceitful political rhetoric, their physical actions were the fruit of their verbal sins.
So David is essentially praying for a kind of divine irony.
Exactly.
He's asking that their own arrogant words and prideful boasts become the net that tangles and traps them.
It's a prayer for reversal rooted entirely in divine justice. The source is constantly warned about the destructive power of words. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21 is just unambiguous. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof.
David trusts that God meticulously records those malicious words and will ensure they're held to account by the very tongue they misused.
Which culminates in David's ultimate goal in verse 13. While he prayed for scattering as a lesson back in verse 11, he now prays for final removal, but the purpose is still focused outwardly on God's glory.
Right. He prays for complete consumption, but for a global reason. Verse 13 says, "Consume them in wrath, consume them that they may not be, and let them know that God ruleth in Jacob unto the ends of the earth."
The intensity is unmistakable with that double use of consume them. David wants the wicked opposition completely and permanently gone, but the reason is paramount. And let them know that God ruleth in Jacob unto the ends of the earth.
So the conclusion of their existence must serve as this clear, undeniable, and universally visible demonstration
That the covenant God of Israel is the supreme sovereign ruler, and that he should be recognized everywhere.
This ambition for God's reputation aligns perfectly with other scriptural calls for God's glory, like Psalm 83, verse 18, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah, art the most high over all the earth.
He wants his personal crisis to have a global theological implications. It's the highest form of faith. To desire that your struggle, regardless of the pain it causes you, ultimately serves to magnify God's truth to the world.
This provides two powerful, actionable steps for you, the listener. First, we have to guard our own speech meticulously, avoiding the pride, the cursing, the dishonesty that God clearly judges. We have to use our words to bring life. And second, and this is crucial, our ultimate goal in any struggle, big or small, should be that through it, God's sovereign rule is made known to everyone watching.
Praying for victory not just for our own comfort, but for God's undeniable public glory.
And with that final, powerful invocation of God's global rule, David moves to the triumphant conclusion of the Psalm, section 6, the defeated foe and the mourning song.
Verses 14 to 17.
Yes.
And David returns to that terrifying image of the dogs, but his tone is utterly transformed. He's no longer describing a threat.
No.
He's describing the pathetic failure of the threat, seen through the eyes of faith. The contrast is so stark. He's essentially reciting the image from the beginning, but with the confidence of the end. Psalm 59, verses 14 and 15. And at evening let them return, and let them make a noise like a dog, and go round about the city. Let them wander up and down for meat, and grudge if they be not satisfied.
They're still making noise, but now it's not the terrifying roar of the hunter waiting for dawn.
No, it's the whining grumble of the unsatisfied scavenger. They are reduced to a spectacle of frustration.
Their power is broken. Their mission is a failure. They wander up and down for meat, searching for sustenance, or maybe for David, but finding nothing.
And they grudge, they grumble, they whine, they are perpetually dissatisfied because their power has been neutralized. David is viewing them through the inevitable lens of God's judgment, defeated and eternally hungry.
And this imagery beautifully aligns with the spiritual reality of our ultimate adversary, who, as 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 says, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. The lion roars, the dog snarls, but ultimately they're defeated foes who will never be satisfied in their quest to devour God's people. We may hear the noise, but we are secure.
And that security, that certainty of eventual victory, sets up this stunning resolution in verse 16.
The beautiful, decisive contrast between the enemy's perpetual howling and David's resolved praise. Let them whine.
But I will sing.
Yeah.
David declares, and this is Psalm 59, verse 16, but I will sing of thy power. Yea, I will sing aloud of thy mercy in the morning. For thou hast been my defense and refuge in the day of my trouble. The emphasis here is on the deliberate choice to praise.
He resolves to sing, focusing entirely on God's character, even while the sound of the snarling dogs is still ringing in his ears.
And he focuses on two essential attributes of God. First, God's power, which ensures the enemy's defeat and scatters the wicked. And second, God's mercy, which ensures David's salvation, not because he earned it, but because God chose to be gracious.
And crucially, he resolves to sing in the morning.
Yes. The morning is the ultimate metaphor for the dawn of deliverance, the inevitable end of the trial. He is singing based on past faithfulness. Thou hast been my defense and refuge in the day of my trouble. And he projects that known character into the guaranteed future outcome. He sings the victory song before the battle is officially over.
That's the definition of forward-looking faith. It's that great biblical theme of hope based on past faithfulness, echoing the ultimate statement of hope in Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness.
He transforms his anxiety into a future tense song, celebrating the victory God has already confirmed. And his confident conclusion in verse 17 summarizes his entire spiritual journey from fear and petition to absolute, enduring faith.
He ends the psalm by addressing God with that intimate and strong title, O my strength. He concludes in verse 17, Unto thee, O my strength, will I sing. For God is my defense and the God of my mercy.
The entire psalm began with a desperate, urgent cry for deliverance, deliver me. And it concludes with the confident, joyful resolution, I will sing. He repeats the key truths that secured him through that long night. God is his high tower of defense and the God of my mercy.
The shift from looking at the enemy's face to looking at God's character is complete and sealed with praise.
It is.
So the final practical step for us is a firm, determined resolution, just like David's. We have to resolve, even while we are still inside our current struggle, the night of trouble, that when the morning of deliverance comes, our first and loudest act will be to sing of God's power and mercy.
We follow David's path by consistently focusing on God's eternal character until certainty utterly replaces fear.
That transformation from being a man trapped and terrified to a man composing a triumphant song is the core lesson of Psalm 59.
It is. David's prayer moves from the immediate granular details of his personal siege to confident, joyful, and public praise. The frightening measure of his enemy, those snarling dogs in verse 7, is completely negated by the powerful, comforting reality of God's sovereign derision in verse 8.
So the journey from siege to song is fundamentally the journey of perspective change.
Exactly.
From looking at the earthbound, limited threat to looking at the heavenly, unlimited throne. And we want to thank the You Need Faith in Jesus team for providing such a meticulous and insightful study, which enabled us to pull these ancient truths into sharp focus for modern crises.
This ancient prayer reminds you that your crises are not intended to be roadblocks to your faith. They are designed to be the very engine of profound, focused, and ultimately triumphant prayer.
And here's a final provocative thought for you to carry forward, building on David's desire for a public lesson. This psalm teaches us to pray not just for our immediate safety and relief, but for God to use our personal struggles to teach a public, powerful, and unforgettable lesson to those watching, magnifying his sovereignty unto the ends of the earth. So the next time you face opposition, big or small, ask yourself this question: how can God use my current trial to ensure my people forget not the consequences of fighting against his truth? And what lesson about his power and mercy will my patient waiting and my eventual song publicly display?